Don't try to do this in 10 months. It was very painful. I'm sure I have a few scars that my therapist is going to help me with, but we're really happy to be where we are. We're really happy to be at the 1-year mark, entering year 2, with dreams of growing and scaling up to better service our system and to really help patients.
Hey everyone, I'm Kostas.
I'm Lester, and welcome to another episode of What's with RWE. So today we got a really special guest today. We're really happy to have Dr. Tarry Ahuja on the podcast today. Tarry is a director of post-market drug evaluation, or PMDE, program at the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, short form CADTH. Is also the architect of CoLab, which we're going to talk a lot about today, which is a pan-Canadian evidence generation network. But on the side, not like he didn't have enough to do already, Tarry is also a lecturer at the Carleton University, teaching biological foundations of addictions and health psychology, which is something I'm going to really get into with you, Tarry. It's very kind of quite interesting there. And he also teaches at the medical school learning stream of behavioral health on the global online learning platform Lecturio. Sorry, did I butcher that a little bit, Tarry? Is it Lecturio?
It's Lecturio, yeah. So you were close.
Lecturio.
You were close.
Perfect. And of course, he has a PhD in neuroscience with a specialty in electrophysiology and pharmacology from Carleton University in lovely Ottawa, Canada. So thanks a lot, Tarry, for joining us today. But did I butcher your last name? Is that how you pronounce it, Ahuja?
No, you actually got it right, which is fantastic. So you get some points for that. It's not an easy one, and you got it. So way to go, Lester.
Perfect. Appreciate that. Tarry is he represents CADTH. However, he does have a statement here that he only represents himself and not of his employer. But Tarry, go ahead.
Sure. I just wanted to, having this great conversation, the ideas and the thoughts I'm going to suggest today are my own. I'm obviously going to be leaning on my experience from CADTH and for my other facets of my work and my experience. I'm happy to interject them all here. But these are my thoughts.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tarry. Before we jump into some, of course, just main reason having you here is because it's the 1 year or close to the 1 year anniversary of CoLab, and having you kind of go through that a little bit. I am curious about this. Did you have a hidden sort of like rap career in your past, given that you prefer to go by T-Bone or T Diddy? I was just curious. I tried to look it up. I went online to see if you actually had a rap career.
Unfortunately, my rap career fizzled early. But yes, those are my street names. T Diddy, T-Bone. I go by a few others, but most just call me Terry, so we could probably just go with that.
I really try my best. I went on YouTube. I was like, I'm so hoping Terry has like a rap career. Like it's secretly deep down, he's like a Drake, right?
A little bit. My mom made me take those all down so I could focus on science. And I don't know if I chose right, but here we are today.
No, I appreciate that. So you know what? We talked a lot about CoLab, and for most of the audience here, who are of course the billions of people across the world, right, listening to this podcast, maybe you can just go through a little bit about who is CoLab or what is CoLab, and then we can kind of jump into there.
Sure. Thanks, Lester. So CoLab is a really innovative idea. It's not that it's a new idea, but I think it's been packaged and positioned in an innovative way. So I think I'll backtrack a little bit about explaining what CADTH is. So CADTH is, as you described, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health. It's a huge mouthful, which is why we abbreviate to just CADTH. CADTH is, in our community, in our ecosystem, well known because it's an HTA body, which stands for Health Technology Assessment. So in English, that is an organization that looks and reviews medicine for comparative effectiveness and cost effectiveness. Again, so does the drug work? Is it priced accordingly? And how does it fare against those that are currently available for other indications? So for example, if you have headaches or migraines, you're currently taking a medicine. If a new medicine comes out, we need to take a look and see, does it work as good or better or worse? And how should it be priced in terms of, is the price that they're proposing appropriate for the benefit that it's providing? I'm clearly oversimplifying, but to the layman or those that are not in this community, that's really what we do. So it's a great organization that's been around for over 25 years, focusing in on this drug review and also taking a look at other technologies and medicines that are in the space and taking a look to see if they provide that benefit. Now, the tail end of that, and we'll get into this probably a little bit later, is around once this medicine enters the market, how is it working? And are there concerns around safety? Is it as advertised? Is it producing a great benefit for migraines, for example, that was told? And so in that space, we want to understand, how can we take a look at that evidence? Now, to do that, we created a network, and we've called this network, quite cleverly, we think, CoLab, which is a nod to a collaborative approach and also multiple labs across our country, or CoLabs. And we created this network of experts and groups that are really vested in the space of looking at evidence, producing evidence, real world evidence. And we receive questions coming in from the decision makers in our country, those that are deciding whether or not we have access to medicine A versus medicine B, and are there safety concerns, Health Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada. These are all groups that are making very big decisions, and they reach out to us to say, we have a question, we have a health policy issue, and we need some evidence. Can you please get that for us? And like picking up the bat phone, they call it the CoLab phone, and we set it in motion, and we have our network produce the evidence we require to answer those questions. And then we're happy to go back to them with a report saying, you asked a question, here's the evidence we could find, now go make an informed decision. So that is, in a nutshell, really what CoLab is and what its purpose is.
So post-marketing drug evaluation existed before CoLab. What makes CoLab different to how it was done in the past? I mean, what was the reason to need CoLab as opposed to the existing method?
Yeah, that's great. I think, like much of our healthcare in our country and its review, a lot of it is done in a siloed fashion. And so groups would gather data and take a look at their questions and answers and do it in isolation, which was necessary at the time because we didn't really have any other means. So we looked to create and to centralize this and coordinate our efforts to be much more efficient. So when a province, for example, I'm just using the examples here, Ontario and perhaps Manitoba have a question related to a drug, it's highly likely that other provinces have similar questions, as we're one Canada, one country with a diverse population. One province's issues is typically another province's issues as it relates to medicine. And so having this ability to work in a coordinated fashion to answer post-market questions is really the key. The other point I want to make is, I think historically our emphasis for post-market data has been on safety, as it should be. Pharmacovigilance, and is this drug safe? Are people dying? Should we pull it from the market? As our infrastructure has grown, as the acceptance of real-world evidence has grown, as its availability has increased, there is an increased willingness from the system to take a look at not only safety, but effectiveness. Is this drug actually working? What you do in a clinical trial versus what happens in the real world is many times different. And so are we able to, in a coordinated fashion, answer those questions? And that's why I feel CoLab and the needs of why we're doing what we're doing has changed versus what was done historically.
Yeah. So I think Lester referenced, CoLab kicked off about a year ago. I think it was last September. It was the official start date. And so you've now had a year of experience. Can you walk us through what some of the, what the experience has been so far, maybe some of the outputs, if there are any, and maybe even some of the learnings that we've seen in terms of how do we do this? How do we do it better?
Yeah, I mean, we're always surprised that we made it a year. We're like, we did it. So that's a huge accomplishment. And launching a program that, you're not really sure how the system is going to accept. We were suggesting some fairly innovative ideas, and we were tasked to doing this in a very short time frame. Typically, to design and launch a program, you're given years to do so. We had, roughly 10 months to put this together, which is quite aggressive for those who haven't done something like this. And so we not only designed, but before we designed, we wanted to listen to how the system needs this information, and what has worked in the past, what has not worked in the past, much like you said, lessons learned. And so we did a bit of a roadshow listening before we decided to design and then execute. And so that listen, learn, lead sort of mantra of designing a program. So we were working through this and put together a program, and then there's always that fear, like, will they come and will we receive queries? And at launch, we kind of sat there, much like you see in the commercials of, are we going to get any orders? And all of a sudden, queries started to begin, conversations began, and we started to understand that the system was actually waiting and really wanting an opportunity to get evidence to use it to make decisions. I think we all would prefer to make an informed decision versus a guesstimate, right? And so that became quite clear. The second thing that really overwhelmed us was the amount that we received. So we received over 20 queries at launch, which I think really is a great pressure test of the system. Typically, you would get a handful of queries, and we received 20. This equated to, after we triaged and figured out what was appropriate, close to 15 queries that are currently underway. And of those 15, 6 have now been completed. So in under a year, we were able to complete 6 queries that we're really happy to report are quite impactful and are leading to change. We're excited to see how that plays out. But we still have many that are underway, and our doors are open. We're constantly having conversations and receiving more. So I think, to answer your second part of the question of lessons learned, I think one lesson that we learned is that the community is really open, ready, and hungry for real-world evidence, especially in the post-market space, to allow them to make better decisions. The second thing is, don't try to do this in 10 months. It was very painful. I'm sure I have a few scars that my therapist is going to help me with, but we're really happy to be where we are. We're really happy to be at the 1-year mark, entering year 2, with dreams of growing and scaling up to better service our system and to really help patients.
One of the things being sort of seeing, how it's grown in the last year that I've really been, I think it is actually an incredibly important part of it is the timeliness. I mean, for a lot of people thinking of answering these queries from decision makers, whether it's the province, whether it's looking at safety, and being able to do it in that sort of 12-month, 10-month period, that's an incredible turnaround. Sort of for answering those questions. And I think relatively unprecedented for the kinds of questions that have come in. So, for me, I think that, you guys really should be proud of being able to hit the mark with that responsiveness to the decision makers.
No, thank you, Kostas. And all compliments I usually accept. Those go to me. All complaints go to the team. No, I agree. I think one of the things that we heard when we did our listening tour was, great work, but you kind of missed the mark. My decision needed to be made 6 months ago or a year ago, and this report took 18 months to 2 years to 3 years. That was very clear. So that was one of our guiding lights of, we need to be fast, and how do you become fast? Now, we didn't want speed to equal less rigor or to produce an inferior product. Actually, the opposite. We said we should be producing an improved product to what has historically been delivered, do it in a faster way, and be focused. And so to do that meant we needed to design a program that was fast, right? So how do we cut the fluff? How do we remove red tape? Where are we able to improve? By centralizing a lot of these tasks to CADTH and to our post-market drug evaluation team at CADTH, we were able to really become efficient. And, we're like well-trained ninjas, and that's all we do. And we take in queries, we scope and refine, and then we work on executing. And if you can rinse and repeat that, you'll only get better. And so, again, I think I concur. I think after a year is done and we looked at what we were able to accomplish in that period of time, kudos goes out to our internal team, the CoLab team, and the network itself. I think it really comes down to the people that you have and their belief in what you're doing. And that belief is there. So it ends up in quick products that are done well, and so far have really received some good impact.
That's amazing.
Great.
So
that's awesome.
You mentioned that you have this vision potentially of expanding. What does that look like in the near term? And maybe even if you want or have already started thinking about how does this evolve in the longer term? What is the unmet need out there that still needs to be delivered to the decision makers?
Yeah, I think whenever you devise a program, you almost at the day of launch, you have to start thinking and discussing what's next. Where do we go? And it's very important for a variety of reasons. I think earlier renditions of endeavors like this have become stagnant and outdated because the system, as we know, changes and evolves continuously. So producing something that hits the mark today will be out of date in a matter of a few years. And the system, as it evolves, you need to continue to evolve. So I think the inclusion and understanding and availability of real world evidence over the last 5 to 7 years has increased significantly. And that is what has allowed CoLab and our PMD program to flourish and even exist because of the availability of that data. When I say we would like to scale up and think forward, part of that is undetermined. It's just we want to follow the trends of the system and have that crystal ball and say, where are we going? What are some of the things? Now, at launch, we focused in on, okay, our bread and butter needs to be queries are coming in, let's execute, and let's show proof of concept. And that has now happened. Looking forward, we understand that we are not the only game in town. We're not the only game in the world. And internationally, there are other groups that do much of the same work, but for their jurisdictions, for their country, for their region. So one of the things that we're trying to invest in is continued strategic partnerships, working with groups like FDA Sentinel, NCEP out of France, NICE, Darwin EU, a variety of groups that are also in the RWE world to support their decision makers. Clearly, we can't be the only ones with these questions. And so it seems silly and inefficient for us to ask the same questions and do the same work when we could be working collaboratively. So in our moniker, CoLab is all about that. We needed to kind of invest a bit in that. More locally, we know that there's a lot of great groups in our country doing either real world evidence work or have clinical expertise in areas that we're very interested in. So how can we leverage what's already here? Let's not recreate things that are already in existence. And so there's great groups in our country that are, again, vested in the understanding of real world evidence, where it's available, how to access it, things that have been funded by our own government that are sitting there unused, which seems so wasteful. So how can we go and make partnerships with them to support them and to broaden what we can do? Other things such as improving stakeholder engagement. So what does that mean in English? There's more in the equation than just decision maker and CADTH CoLab. Clearly, there's more to that equation. And that equation includes industry, it includes patients, it includes clinicians, it includes the community. How do we do a better job of having those conversations, right? So we have, since launch, created an advisory committee, which is a multi-stakeholder committee. This is a novel approach. It's not usually done this way, but we try to include as many voices so that we can have that well-rounded strategic conversation that considers those perspectives. Like, what is industry thinking about real evidence? What is the patient thinking? How are clinicians receiving it? What are payers thinking? Public and private insurers, and our jurisdictions that are deciding. So the long-winded answer to your fairly short question is, where are we going? The sky's the limit. I think our easy wins in front of us are really anchored around strategic partnerships, leveraging what's already in existence, and growing our program, building our CoLab network, perhaps getting more folks that are part of the research network that can contribute to the great questions coming in.
Great. That's like, I think, music to the ears of everyone. The thing that's I think I want to highlight is one of our board members is Barry Stein, who is president of Colorectal Cancer Canada. And just hearing you say that you want to engage patients is going to make him super, super happy. And he was all about the patient advocacy. The patient voice needs to be heard. So I think everyone does appreciate that, completely. Now, before we jump into a little bit more about RWE, because I think that's where this is leading. Well, obviously, most of the conversation around CoLab, but more specifically around maybe how RWE fits into regulatory and maybe payer decision making. I want to ask a little bit about yourself, Terry, just because you brought up that you're going to maybe have to go see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, right? That's necessary. The thing is that you also teach on the side, right? This concept of health psychology. Maybe you can go through a little bit about the side gig of yours. Like you're Batman here, so in that case you're Batman at night, and then in the mornings you're Bruce Wayne. So maybe if you can just educate the audience a little bit about who you are, how you got to CADTH, and a little bit these other things that you do on the side that I assume you're very, very passionate about.
Oh, sure, Lester. So buckle up, and I'm going to give you the Terry story. So I'll spare you, and I'll give you just the highlights and the abbreviated version. But I was, like a lot of folks, I was pursuing a gymnastics career in Cirque du Soleil, and after a horrific accident, I did what most do, and that is go to science. And so science was always something that was near and dear to me, and sort of pursued that, and it led all the way up to a PhD. And it really helped me understand the things within science that really resonated with me, and understanding the brain and how it works was so captivating. And that idea of being able to be in a lab and think creatively and do research and experiments really got my attention, and I invested heavily in that. It was there that I understood and started to play with the idea of pharmacology and how drugs impact the brain. And so in doing like sort of live experiments, in rodent models, to looking at electrophysiology. And for those who don't know what that is recording from individual brain cells in an animal or human, almost always an animal, that you do that, and you can record to see how signals are working, how different brain regions are positioned, what their function is, et cetera, et cetera. In that journey, you sometimes can use a variety of drugs to dissect a signal to understand, is it this type of transmitter? What does this drug do? Does it block the signal? And it helps you sort of decipher and do a little CSI and figure how things are working in the brain. I found that exhilarating. I'm using different drugs to like investigate stuff, and it became very cool for me. So electrophysiology is a really fine technique that requires like fine motor skill, patience to record from brain cells, and a rat brain, as you can imagine, is painfully hard. So it really tests your patience. And after doing that and completing my PhD and sort of writing the articles that, as most researchers do, I felt happy, but I didn't feel necessarily completely fulfilled. I felt like there was more. So I continued to do the research, working at the National Research Council of Canada, looking at using the same technique to study Alzheimer's and stroke models and ischemia, really great, helpful things. But I felt I needed to do more. A lot of researchers can contest to this. You work in your little bubble to answer those very specific questions, and you publish this very specific paper, and you hope that billions will read, but the 9 who read it say, well done, and 4 of those are your family. You're kind of like, wow, did I make a difference? Am I making any change here? That was when I was, my attention was brought to CADTH, a group doing something that's related to health policy and helping decision change and looking at evidence to make decisions. And I was like, wow, I didn't even know we had something like that. I think a lot of folks in the community assume there's a magical hidden body that tests and checks all of our medicines and controls what we get. And to me, it was just, I had no idea what that looked like. And I was sort of given the opportunity. I applied, I got in, and I was a research officer where I actually worked on files for specific medicines, and where you get right into the weeds of clinical trials and understanding. And when I saw the amount of rigor that went into a clinical review for a single drug, and the expert review committee and the recommendations that come out of that, and how that gets parlayed into the system, blew my mind. So I was in love, and I was like, that's it. So that was where the love affair began. And so for the next 5 years, I continued at CADTH working on that and learning all the different aspects of the business. But after 5 years, I started to wonder, manufacturers are producing this information and then they're submitting it to Health Canada and CADTH for review. What is it like over there, and how are they positioning themselves, and what work are they doing? And so I think, to the chagrin of many, I switched teams and I moved to industry for a stint for 5 years. And there I learned the business in terms of medical research. And I was a senior real world evidence scientist for a manufacturer. And I learned a lot. And I was part of a regional international team for Europe and Canada. And so I was able to see how things are being done in other countries, Germany, Spain, France. It was eye-opening, and it really helped you understand the global community that we're in, and how data is not so different. Yes, our countries are different, but the questions and the issues that we face are very, very similar. And COVID was a fantastic example of how that crystallized things for the world, and how we all have a similar problem, and that's the COVID virus, right? So that for me was really, really fantastic. And after my stint in industry, my friends at CADTH came back to me and saying, listen, this whole RWE thing, what is RWE? And this is in advance of your podcast, Lester and Kostas. They said, what's this all about, and what should we do? And they enticed me to come back and say, can you help us set up things and discuss the ideas around real world evidence and go down that avenue? And I was happy to. And I said, this is really great. And And so I started my round trip back to CADTH on my second tour. And I've now been back at CADTH collectively. Collectively, we've been at CADTH for almost 12 years. And so I clearly, you understand, I'm very vested in real world evidence. I'm really vested in evidence for decision making. Then 2 years ago, I was given the opportunity to develop and build this post-market drug evaluation program and this CoLab network. And for me, it was all those years of work and understanding and travels and led to the culmination of the creation of something, a lever that was going to have some impact. So that's why sometimes I get a bit jazzed. I apologize, but it's because it's everything coming together to allow us to do something really, really novel and useful. Now, throughout that process, I, like many in our community of researchers, I'm a workaholic. And so I said, that's all great, but other opportunities pop up and I have trouble saying no. And so when my old alma mater came knocking saying, Terry, would you be interested in teaching? You'd be great at this with your experience. Are you interested? And at first I said no. And they said, that's too bad. We've already put your name down on the course. I said, okay, I guess I'm teaching the class. And so off I went. And it's now been 18 years of me teaching at Carleton University. And it's been a pleasure to be back in that community, to feel that energy that students bring, the open eyes of the pure eyes, the virgin eyes that haven't been beaten down by the travels that we have, and to help educate them on a variety of things. So my mantra for teaching is, and we've all been in this place, we've had profs that we're terrible, and we're like, why is this guy teaching this class? He so doesn't want to be here, and he's just reading out of the text. I said, if I was ever given that opportunity, I would do it completely different. And I'm lecturing not because I'm a professor and I run a lab and I have to. I'm doing it because I want to. And I want to give back to the school and to the community and the student population and help educate them. Because this stuff is cool. For us nerds, I love this stuff. This is pretty cool. And so I like to bring in my real world experience and real world evidence on RWE and CADTH and the world as it relates to pharmacology and making decisions to the class. That's outside of the textbook. That's a lot of the stuff they'll never hear and see about anywhere else. And to me, that's exhilarating. And the feedback I typically get from students is, man, that class was awesome. I heard all this stuff that I've never heard of before, and it's really opened my eyes, and I've decided to shift my direction into something more aligned with what you're doing. And can we be best friends? I get a lot of best friends things. I unfortunately have to limit that, but it's been great. So that's why I do some of those things, and that's a bit of my journey.
Well, now we know how CADTH is creating a pipeline for future talent. It's the Terry show at Carleton. But
it must be like quite an interesting teach, because the class you're teaching, the health psychology component, right? That seems like a very, very, what's the best way to say it? In some ways, a hot topic right now, right? So RW, obviously a hot topic, but this concept of health psychology is probably pretty hot as well, primarily, especially given the pandemic, right? Where a lot of the ailments people may have now is due to, say, heightened anxiety.
Very much so. The approach of health psychology is not a new topic, but it's become very, like real world evidence over the past few years, it's become sexy, it's become hot. And part of the reasons that it has is because, there's a lot of bad that came out of COVID. Let's be honest, it was terrible for the world. But there are some positives that have come out of it. It's been galvanizing in a lot of ways, and it's heightened people's awareness of medicine and evidence and how health policy works. So, for those that sit in the system, we're like, yay, people finally know what I do and I'm making a difference. So that was really great. But for health psychology, to me, one of the things that resonates the most that I teach my students, I tell my friends, I tell my family, there's two philosophies and approaches to health. There's one called the biomedical approach, which is pretty standard, I would say, pre-COVID. And historically what our parents and most of us are used to. And then there's the new approach, which is the biopsychosocial approach, or the BPS approach. And I'll just really quickly explain the difference. Biomedical, you hone in on two major areas, which is biologically, how are you doing? And physiologically, is there something there that we can address? It's just around medicines. You have a stomach ache, I'm going to give you a medicine for your stomach ache. Now, the biopsychosocial approach, as the name implies, looks at the biological, the psychological, and the social components to our health. So do you have a headache? Why do you have a headache? oh, because your wife is leaving you and you're going through a miserable divorce, that therefore you have a headache. So I'm not going to just give you something for your headache. Why don't we talk about that? We can suggest some therapy, some counseling, and yes, I can give you something ad hoc for your headaches, but it's a more holistic approach to health. Now, fast forward to when COVID hit, I think the majority, a lot of folks in our communities were honed in on the biomedical approach. Life progressed, you do your thing. If you have a stomach ache, you're tired, you can't sleep, you have depression, you take the medicines that are required. However, we're now understanding that health is much more than that. So there are psychosocial components, there's your network of support, there are a variety of things that impact your health. The unknowing outcomes, the heightened sense of anxiety that is being projected by decision makers and governments and the world and the news really freaked people out. And they were like, I don't know, I'm feeling uneasy, I can't sleep, I can't eat. On top of the fact that I might get an illness that will kill me, this really caused this multifaceted impact on people. And so doctors were now forced to consider the biopsychosocial approaches to health versus just a straight, I'm going to write you a prescription. And so this shift has happened over the last 5 to 7 years, and they've actually now adapted the medical school training programs to consider biopsychosocial aspects of health. So those are some of the components I teach for the medical modules. And that is why it is the next generation of doctors that are coming out are going to have to consider all these various components to health.
That's amazing. I'm just curious now, think about that. There's obviously that means more data is going to be generated, right? In some ways, if we want to put it down in a kind of a binary computer engineering way, right? More data is going to be generated. So maybe you can speak a little bit more about how RWE fits into regulatory and payer decision making right now, and maybe even into the future, the one that you kind of you're painting, where you're actually gathering more information about the overall true holistic person as opposed to just the biomedical component.
Sure. I think we could have a whole session, a 2-hour session just on this question, because it's a really big question.
Great. We'll book you for another 2 hours.
Okay, perfect. So some people might, say, well, my God, he didn't get that right, or he's missing out so many important pieces. And this is my disclaimer. So this is going to be a really truncated, abbreviated, simplistic approach to your what is, I think, a very complicated question. The first thing I'll start with is, what is real world evidence? In the audience, I know you've had other podcasts, and there's a lot of information out there as what is real world evidence. And let's acknowledge that it's really new packaging. It's a sexy title for something that's been around for a very long time, which is observational data and observational research. And there's a variety of other things that have now bundled under real world evidence. And people say, well, is my iWatch data, does that count in my steps and my shopping habits and my perusing on Instagram and socials? Does that all count? It counts, but you can see how the spectrum can go from really specific, researcher-led real-world evidence and data to iWatch steps. Okay, so that's a huge continuum, and we're not talking about all of that data, right? So we're talking about there's very specific data that is necessary for regulatory and HTA decision making. So let's fast forward to that. Let's remove the stuff that is, I don't want to say is anecdotal, but it's not what we're specifically talking about. The second thing is, how has the landscape changed? And I alluded to it a couple of times. And historically, some of the barriers to gathering of good real world data has been general acceptance as to what am I actually capturing? So if Tom captures it one way and Dick captures it another way and Harry captures it another way and Sally a fourth way, all of a sudden they all said, hey, I got real world data, but it's all different. Okay, can you pool it? Maybe not. Can you compare it? Probably not. And all of a sudden you have great pockets of data that are unusable for the means of answering broad questions. Okay, so that's a problem. Now, what has changed over time is general consensus and guiding principles and an international drive to at least acknowledge, different types of real world data. How should it be captured? What are some norms? Here are some templates. Here are some tools. So that has just generally elevated the game of real world data and real world evidence around the world. Another thing that has happened is technology has improved. So back in the day, if you wanted to house all this patient data, you're going to need a pretty big server. And it's like that analogy of like the first rocket launch to the moon versus we have more power in a calculator today than what they had on a whole floor of NASA, right? So same thing has happened, a lot less dramatic, but servers and the cost to run servers and all that kind of stuff versus now you can pop into Costco and get like a 4 terabyte drive for $200, or you can get Amazon Cloud Space or Google. So it's cheap. So the ability to hold data, the softwares available to capture patient data have all improved exponentially and are much more cost effective. So now a network of 5 doctors can capture the same type of data that would be captured, that would have 10 years ago been a huge multi-million-dollar endeavor you can now do on a shoestring budget on the corner of your desk. So that has been fantastic. The last, I think, a very important piece is our understanding, our knowledge, and acceptance of real-world evidence has improved considerably. So payers, those that are making decisions, understand what real-world data is, what real-world evidence is, and that is in a large part due to things like this podcast and symposiums and articles and presentations where people are talking about it, and it's now become mainstream. This isn't a fringe, weird activity. This is standard business. And so those things put together have really elevated the game and use of real-world evidence. So to answer your question, Kostas, of how is this being used and how do we see it being used, I can speak from the CADTH lens and a little bit on the regulator's lens, but CADTH has for many years accepted real-world evidence, but in different aspects of our business. So if we're trying to understand currently in the community, in our ecosystem, how are patients using this medicine? And we look at something we call current utilization, which is real-world evidence looking at how many patients are taking this drug, what is the frequency, what is the dose, and we can break it down by country, by city, et cetera, et cetera. And that really gives you a good snapshot of like, wow, this drug's really being used, maybe even inappropriately. I'll give you an example of Ozempic right now, which is very popular. And Ozempic was an anti-diabetic drug, which had an added benefit of some weight loss. Well, people hear that weight loss and what do you think is going to happen? People are like, I need this drug, right? I don't want to go to the gym. I just want to eat Ozempic. And that's what happened. And is the utilization of Ozempic far surpassed what had been projected. And that is because patients that should not have been taking, the non-targeted patient, some of them don't even have diabetes. Actually, the majority don't have diabetes, are taking this drug. And so you can imagine manufacturers and payers are saying, wait a second, we expected 50,000 doses to be filled and we're at 1 million. Something's up, right? And that's real world evidence in action. Okay, so a great example of how as a HTA body and a regulator, it's being used. So we also want to understand disease burden and or current practice. How is a certain disease state currently being treated? And real world evidence is accepted there. Okay, so we're happy to use it there. Where historically we have not used it is we follow the hierarchy of evidence, meaning we start with the best data, which is a double-blind RCT, systematic review, properly run and controlled studies, which has been the gold standard for a very long time. And that is what industry submits, and that is what is requested, and that is what was used. So if you have the best, why would you want observational research? That's not controlled, and you can't control the patient population, and it's a mixed bag, and you can't equate the benefit or harms directly to a drug. There's too many confounding variables. I don't want that. For the parts where you look at comparative efficacy, I want the best. Over time, we've realized that RCT, double-blind RCTs, and clinical data is not all clinical trial data is not always the best data. We need more fit-for-purpose data. Sometimes there are questions that can only best be answered by real-world evidence. And so real-world evidence has now been pitched as not a replacement for RCTs or that type of data, but a supporting tool. We've now added another valuable tool in the toolbox. And so there's a greater willingness to say, okay, yeah, I'll look at that RCT data and I'll look at the great clinical trials, but I also want to look at this RWE because there's certain patient populations that were not included in the clinical trial, like pregnant women, elderly, children. And they're not going to be included in these clinical trials, but I have some real world evidence that might allow me to at least make an educated guess. It's not killing little kids. It's not killing our grandparents. Maybe it can be used with some caveats and things of that nature. So those types of conversations are happening, and that is where real world evidence is now starting to become more prominent. Also, what is blown up is drugs for rare disease or things in the oncology space where there is it's much harder to run a well-populated clinical trial because of the lower incidence. Maybe you only have 7, 10, 15 patients. It's really hard to do an RCT. It's also ethically not the greatest thing. I know you have cancer, but I'm going to give you these placebo tic tacs versus the actual treatment. You kind of can't go down that route. So when there's this high unmet need and this urgent need for this medicine, but there's high level of uncertainty, we're willing to accept real world evidence because you can't do a large clinical trial. And there's another opportunity where real world evidence is starting to be used in decision making. So I think looking forward, as we get better at coordinating our RWE generation efforts, and there's continued acceptance and greater examples of it being useful, it will be more and more integrated into the process of how the regulator and HTA bodies use it for decision making.
I want to springboard off of that last scenario because I think it's a really important one. Increasingly, we know we're getting, let's say for high unmet need areas, oncology being one, rare disease being one, pediatric indications, oftentimes same thing. You're getting less than the data you would typically accept in a regulatory file or even in a payer decision file. But, because of the high unmet need, oftentimes there is the pressure to reimburse and to give access to patients. The concept that I know is being reviewed right now is time limited reimbursement, and which tends to make sense. So what do you see RWE really having that pivotal role in that time limited reimbursement concept to supplement the data? Because it doesn't change. It's still unethical. It's still a challenge to find the numbers in that kind of a population. Is that sort of the future we're looking at, where it's kind of a rolling decision-making process as opposed to a one and done that it's always been in the past?
Most definitely, Kostas. I think there's other countries that have already embraced this. So I'm looking at NICE as an organization. They make recommendations and they have a revisit. So they'll say, we will continue to monitor the evidence field to see if our initial recommendation still stands or we need to pivot and adapt. I think the idea of one and done is just too dated now. Our field is advancing far too quickly with new medicines coming every day and the evidence pool continually growing, especially for all the reasons I said earlier. RW is becoming more available and relevant and prevalent. I think to answer your question around the time-limited recommendations, this has been an idea that has been cooking for a very long time. So I don't think the idea was novel. We just didn't have the infrastructure to actually execute on time-limited recommendations. Yeah. So to your point, if a drug needs to come out because there is nothing else and the preliminary data looks promising, it's a great opportunity for real-world evidence to show its value, to say, well, listen, I will come back in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and I will have this real-world data to validate what I'm saying, because now you've allowed me to release it into the general population, help who we can help, and we can strengthen that business case by showing you that the data is validating that. Obviously, the caveats would be the moment you see a safety concern, it would be halted, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's created a new lane, and it's really ultimately going to benefit the patients. Those are the ones that have the highest unmet need. They need this medicine, and we don't want that process to get stuck with, the bureaucrats and the red tape that are put in place to confirm efficacy and safety, but they shouldn't prevent quick access to medicines. And again, I keep using this example, but COVID was a great example of that, right? The world had a high unmet need, and people were saying, well, why is this process that normally takes 2 years done in 1 month or 2 months? Why can that be done always? Or did you cut corners? What the heck happened? Those of us that are in the system realize we didn't cut any corners. We just killed ourselves to make it happen. But it's a great example of how we were able to do something quickly, and how after the fact, after the recommendations came out, we continued to monitor the evidence as it became available in a real world setting to continue to revise our recommendations on a day-to-day basis. Dr. Tam would be on the TV and people were saying, oh, there she goes, switching her ideas again. That's because she was actually pivoting on the latest and greatest real world evidence, which is fantastic. It's how it should be.
Yeah. There's so much promise, but if you had to ask for one wish to really accelerate what we're doing here today, not just using real world data, but using it for real decisions, real practical decisions, what would you want to see, whether it's a change in the landscape, a change in users' attitudes? I mean, what is it out there that would really accelerate the ability to start using this data as fast as it can be produced? I mean, what are we waiting for?
That's a great question. And you're sure I only get one, right? I only get one.
I'm only going to give you one on this one. I know there's always tons, but what's your top ask?
Yeah, one of your examples you said is, is it the landscape needs to change? I think the landscape's doing fantastic. Okay. I think the landscape is progressing very well, and that has never been our barrier, our major challenge. I also don't think it's the technology aspect of it. So that means our willingness to understand the methods and having databases and actual IT things that allows us to do real world evidence. I don't think that's a problem either. It's sad for me to say, but it's around perception and perceived risks is really our biggest barrier. So I know in every community, in every group, you're going to have the early adopters, the hungry ones, the mavericks. Then you're going to have the ones that are just completely anxiety ridden and don't go to sleep and need to take, Metamucil often. And then you have the middle cohort that are just kind of like, well, I guess I'll follow what you think is best. My one wish is that cohort of early adopters and those that are willing to really dive in, if that pool would expand, because I feel like those that are, I don't want to generalize, but a lot of the old guard or folks that are stuck in that's not how we do things tend to slow down this innovation. But I think that holds true for anything. It's not just RWE, or it holds for, whether it's the newest iPhone versus flip phones or what have you. There's people that like their old stuff and like the old way. But I think if I had a magic wand and a wish, it would to really be to reduce the level of perceived risk and bias. Not to be reckless, but to at least lower that down. And I think many that are around, that have been around for long enough, really appreciate that nobody's in this to be sneaky and to do anything bad. We're all in this to say, no, we're generating good data here. We want it to be used in a useful way. Why would industry want to create data and not really use it? It defeats the purpose. And same thing with those on the public side. If we have access to data, if we're doing really great research, we should not be afraid to make a decision on something that is what used to be considered atypical. And I'm referring to the real world evidence. I think that should become part of the new normal. And if we could help people overcome that hurdle, overcome that hump, and say, okay, the world will not fall apart if we consider real world evidence. The world will not fall apart if we take some innovative approaches to tackling old questions. I think that would be a huge catalyst to how things in our world really work and the benefit that we can provide.
Terrific.
That's great, because in some ways you talked about how other countries already do this, right? Like I think NICE was one that you mentioned, and I think there's others around the world itself. Is that insufficient, I guess, for individuals in Canada or decision makers in Canada, or how does one think about that? What's happening in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I think globally there's great examples, and what the easiest defense for most is, well, we're different in Canada. Like things are different here. And the U.S. model is different than the Canadian model, which is different than the EU model, which is different than the German model, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of truth to that. So I'm sort of oversimplifying when I'm saying, oh, they're already doing it. They are doing aspects of what we're proposing, but they are in a different fishbowl. Now, my answer to that, though, is, are there similarities to the system? And are there things that we can learn from how they're doing? And the obvious answer is yes, of course. And so countries like, the EU and Europe, their system is very analogous to ours, whereas the US model is much different. It's harder to correlate what's being done in the States to us. However, what's being done in other parts of Europe, they have a similar system. CADTH in many ways has emulated itself when it was launching to how does NICE do things? Because NICE is sort of the gold standard in the world, and their system is very similar to ours. So we learned a lot from NICE. We've now grown to be our own thing, but you have to give a nod to somebody like NICE and say, you guys are doing things well, and they're continuing to always innovate, and we can learn from them. The example I like to cite is in Germany, where drugs are almost automatically, as long as they're deemed safe, are given market access, but for a time-limited period, a year. And within a year, they need to have gathered enough evidence in the post-market space to come back and pass a reassessment, which will allow continued access. If it's not doing as advertised, guess what? You're out, right? And if you're doing just as good or better, we'll increase or maintain your access. That's a really great model, and it works for them. I don't know if that would necessarily work for us, but the point there is they are readily capturing and embracing and appraising real-world evidence for continued access. And that's really what we're suggesting here. We're saying, how do we use real world evidence in the post-market space to do a better job? Like, what's our rearview mirror? Do we have a rearview mirror? And currently, I don't think we have a great rearview mirror. But with initiatives like this and others, it will garner us the opportunity to reassess drugs or to reappraise them or to allow earlier access so that we can say, okay, we know this is needed. There's some evidence showing that it works. It's deemed safe, but I'm going to need to see more. And that tail end is what we really need to support and say, yes, that allows for better access and us continuing to make decisions based on the latest and greatest evidence.
Got it. So if I may not summarize, but a couple of things I pulled out from there is one of which is it's not that we're going to just use someone else's data from outside of Canada because it's so different than what we have in Canada, but we're going to adopt maybe learnings from them and how they structure themselves, the applications, but to really support the individuals in Canada who are the decision makers who need, that little bit of additional handholding, if we could say, right? It's the learnings from outside, but with Canadian data. Would that be an adequate way of summarizing that?
Close. I mean, that's one scenario. Yes, we would show proof of concept by what's being done in other countries, but there's also the opportunity when there's a lack of data in our own country that we can leverage. So CADTH and other groups and regulators do consider international data. So it's not off the table. Usually our preference is Canadian data. That is our home base. Obviously, that's what we would like, but sometimes it's just not available or there's just not enough patients yet that have received this medicine. But it was available in Germany, for example, for years. Many times manufacturers release into the larger markets first. So typically the U.S. goes first, Europe is second, and then we fall somewhere lower on that list. And so if we know this medicine has been available for a little bit of time, why would we not look at that data? Obviously, that is valuable information. And so it's not that we're necessarily averse to using non-Canadian data. I just think that the pecking order is typically Canadian data first. We want to show proof of concept, and we're willing to look at other sources of data, when it's fit for purpose. If that's what's available, then let's take a look at it.
Perfect. And I know our producers made it really clear. We've always gone over time, so we got to start wrapping things up. But on that specific note, there, maybe this is maybe a little bit open-ended question, but in the perfect world, like Terry's perfect world, right, of RWE, right, PMDE just becomes this huge blockbuster hit, right? Like what happens, right? What is the end result? Because as you have already stated, Canadians, we're not necessarily, as you even suggested, we're not in the high in the pecking order of maybe manufacturers coming to Canada first, right? They go to say Germany, as you referenced, and then on top of it, our healthcare system spend is just ever increasing. In 2000, I think it was something like 8%. Now it's 13%, and it's projected to only grow because of the growing older population, of course, immigration as well, a very, very large population coming in. So if PMDE becomes a blockbuster hit, what is Terry's world? That could you paint us a picture of how PMDE kind of supports kind of a brighter future, let's say?
Sure. I mean, obviously, to start, I would have to build some form of PMDE castle, and I would have a throne of some kind, right? So nothing too big, but big enough. No, I think that it's a great question because I think everybody has their own dream or goal of what it could be, and I don't want to make this an individual goal. This isn't really about me. I think this is about sort of my team, the network that we've built, and the endeavor to make really good decisions. And the future, I think, as you've mentioned already, Lester, with those stats, our system is maxed out. And I can tell you on an almost daily basis, we engage with those decision makers. So those that are trying to scratch their head saying, here's my budget, here are the amount of people that live in my province, and I need to somehow take care of all these people. And every day, new medicines are being churned out, right? Should we be covering them all? Do they actually work? Are they providing benefit? How is this brand new shiny drug compared to the generic that costs me pennies a day? Is it that much better that I should be spending an additional few $1 million a year? Those are the types of questions that they're inundated with every day. So in my dream scenario, I think the couple things that we need to hone in on is efficiencies. So I think people many times view real world evidence as us lowering the evidentiary bar, saying, oh, it's a shortcut and it's a way for us to save money. clearly there's savings, and yes, it is faster, but it doesn't necessarily mean it does not provide value or can't help us make great decisions. And so I think looking forward, in my dream scenario, real world evidence isn't looked at as an odd cousin that eats paste. It's instead something that's at the table that provides equal value considering the task at hand. The other thing that I think that needs to happen is we need to have shared responsibility. And what I mean by that is it isn't just CADTH's responsibility or a PMDE or CoLab network or even Health Canada's responsibility. This is an ecosystem task. Okay, so that means industry, that means payers, that means everybody in the system has to work together, which is really hard. It gets painfully hard to say, let's all agree to work on something to produce evidence that we can all use, we can all co-own, and it is done in a mutually beneficial way. Can we do that? And a lot of people are like, well, I don't know. It's really tough. And I'm pushing towards trying to do more of that. I'm not the only one. Clearly, there's a lot of people that are about that. And if we can make that happen, all of a sudden, a lot of the things that were huge issues for us will just dissolve. They will go away. It doesn't mean all of our problems are solved, but some really big slowing us down problems will have been taken care of. The piece that I mentioned to you is the efficiencies. I think if we can do a better job of, and there's a new buzz term, I'm giving you a sneak peek to something that you're going to have to do a new podcast in a few years, and that is the term of formulary management. So what does that mean? That means managing your house. Okay, so each province has to manage its own formulary. As a country, we have to manage our formularies. And currently, we have a really hard time saying no to certain things and or taking away things that are on a formulary. Okay, and that is for a lot of reasons, and we won't go there today. But they shouldn't always be on our formulary. For example, there's barbiturates or benzos that are overprescribed in many ways. And should they still be prescribed? Should they still be on our formulary? Should they still be available? And a lot of times the answer is, God, no. Like, why are we still covering that? And it's because a lot of the jurisdictions don't have the bandwidth or capacity or time to go back and do this report card and the screening and fixing or management of their formulary. And this is where post-market drug evaluation and things like formulary management come into play, where we can just remove the dead bits and remove the parts that are not providing value. And those savings alone magically would make a huge difference. And I'm not talking like a couple $100,000. I'm talking millions of dollars of savings and improvement in efficiencies that will allow us to then reinvest in our own healthcare, in our own system, provide the latest and greatest. And that is, in my dream world, where I think we really invest in, is doing a better job of that rearview mirror, improving our efficiencies, and all of that will then just let the rest sort of come in play. And that early piece is really, really integral, which is that collaborative approach to post-market evaluation, like doing it together. If industry can say, yes, we're happy to fund a project that we're doing with the regulator and the HTA bodies to produce something that we can all use. It seems a little bit counterintuitive for them to go off in a corner and produce some data and then kind of give it to you with shaking hands saying, is this going to work? If we had that conversation earlier on, there would be no misunderstandings. There would be much more efficient transfer of data or generation of data. So that's my dream world, including my castle and throne.
Great. No, appreciate it very much there, Terry. So I'm just going to wrap things up because we don't want to take up too much of your time, given the fact that you're a lecturer, you're on the Justice League, right? You're Batman here as well. So appreciate you very much. And we appreciate you letting us join the Justice League as well, actually. So, thank you very much for your time. So everyone, thank you very much for joining in another podcast of What's with RWE. If you like this episode, please subscribe. Also, if you have any feedback for us, please comment below as well. So thank you very much, Terry, again, for joining us today.
And Kostas and Lester, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the great conversation. And RWE for life.
Excellent. Exactly.
Sounds good.
We should get tattoos, matching tattoos for that.
I already got one. I'll show you mine later. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.